I'm hoping that in these last few lectures you've been noticing a sort of developing pattern of thinking about macroeconomic issues in two different time frames. A Keynesian time frame, which is a relatively short time frame of a few years, kind of the time between recessions, and long-term time frame, which is the right neoclassical framework for thinking about long-term growth. The next two lectures we're going to think about fiscal policy using these two different main time frames. We're first in this lecture going to focus on the short term, which in this context means a few years, sort of the time period between recessions, and focus on how fiscal policy should react depending on whether an economy is in a recession or whether it's producing at or above potential GDP. So that'll be the focus of this lecture. Then the next lecture will focus on the long run, which means how fiscal policy contributes to national saving and thus affects investment, economic growth, and the balance of trade. Now, let's back up a half step here and remember what is included in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, as we talked about in the earlier lecture, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Now, of those categories of aggregate demand, two of them can be particularly affected by fiscal policy, by tax policy, and spending policy. One, obviously, is government spending. If government spends a lot more money, that tends to increase aggregate demand. It's also true that the consumption category, C, and the investment category, I, can be strongly affected by tax policy as well. Tax cuts can increase consumption and investment. Tax increases could slow down consumption and investment. Thus, key point, fiscal policy has the power to shift aggregate demand. It can increase the amount of aggregate demand in the economy or decrease the amount of aggregate demand in the economy. So, we're going to think about some terminology here for when you're either increasing or decreasing aggregate demand. If you're increasing the amount of demand or buying power in the economy, we're going to call that expansionary macroeconomic policy, to expand aggregate demand. That's also sometimes called a loose policy. The idea is to put more buying power out there in the economy. So a policy of tax cuts or a policy of spending increases is an expansionary fiscal policy, to have more buying power out there in the economy. The macroeconomic policies that are used to reduce aggregate demand, in contrast, are called contractionary policies or tight fiscal policies. So a policy of tax increases or a policy of spending cuts is going to be a contractionary or a tight fiscal policy. So with this terminology in hand, we now want to think about countercyclical fiscal policy. And this word countercyclical just means that the fiscal policy in the economy is counterbalancing the business cycle of recession and recovery. So, for example, if the economy is in a recession, so it's producing less than the potential GDP it could produce, then you use expansionary fiscal policy to increase aggregate demand and push output in the economy up toward potential GDP. On the flip side, if the economy is producing at or above its potential GDP, as the U.S. economy was probably doing during what we could now call the bubble economy of the late 1990s, then you could use fiscal policy to hold down aggregate demand and prevent the economy from moving into a situation where inflation might occur with too much money chasing too few goods. So fiscal policy can be used to address these cyclical issues moving back and forth in the economy. In particular, the difficulty with a recession, remember, is that there isn't enough aggregate demand in the economy. And fiscal policy can be used to address the unemployment that results in that situation. In a recession, the government policy of spending more or taxing less would pump up aggregate demand. As there's more aggregate demand in the economy, firms are going to be more willing to hire people, and the amount of cyclical unemployment should go down. You'd want to increase aggregate demand by enough to push the economy up to its potential GDP or its full employment GDP. And in theory, you could do that either with lower taxes or with higher spending. Now again, In this approach, the issue is not looking at government spending one program at a time. We're not trying to say, does this program make sense or does that make sense? In a macroeconomic sense, all we care about is getting the economy moving, is pumping up the amount of aggregate demand. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, in his General Theory, explained when he was inventing this approach during the great unemployment of the Great Depression of the 1930s, he argued that, it doesn't matter what you do with the money. The point is to get more aggregate demand. And so to sort of emphasize that point, he argued in this way. He said, if the Treasury were to fill old bottles with banknotes and bury them at a suitable depth in disused coal mines, which were then filled up to the surface with town rubbish, and leave it to private enterprise on the well-tried principles of laissez-faire to dig the notes up again, there need be no more unemployment. And with the help of the repercussions, the real income of the community and its capital wealth also would probably become a great deal greater than it actually is. It would indeed be more sensible to build houses and the like, but if there are political and practical difficulties in the way of this, then the above would be better than nothing. He said, ancient Egypt was doubly fortunate and doubtless owed to this its fabled wealth in that it possessed two activities, namely pyramid building as well as the search for precious metals, the fruits of which, since they could not serve the needs of man by being consumed, did not stale with abundance. The Middle Ages built cathedrals and sang dirges. 2 pyramids, 2 masses for the dead are twice as good as one, but not so 2 railways from London to New York. So the point Keynes is making there is, when you're trying to pump up aggregate demand and get more spending, it doesn't matter whether the spending is actually useful. Sure, it would be nice if it was useful. It would be nice if it could be a house or a railway. But, when you're trying to get more aggregate demand, burying money in old coal mines and having people dig it up is as good as anything. Building pyramids is as good as anything. Building cathedrals is as good as anything. From a macroeconomic point of view, the goal here is get more money in the economy.